The reason I'm very uneasy about the world not being able to agree on what a man and woman is that I've been married for 21 years. It is by far the greatest joy of my life. And I'm talking, I've made a lot of fucking money. And I'm just here to tell you, as powerful as money is, it will not bring to your life what a
Amen.
thriving marriage will. Not in
Amen.
a million years. So my wife becomes predictable to me when I think of her in classic feminine ways. And she becomes unpredictable to me when I think she's like me. And at the beginning of our marriage, it was very confusing because I didn't think about it. So I just assumed that she was like me. So I did not have the consilience, is that the word, of knowledge at the time, and was blind to the fact that I didn't have that. And so there was so much friction. And a lot of that friction has worked out over time by literally spending research hours on what are the differences between men and women.
Right.
And as the two of us did that, we were like, oh my God, that's why you act like that. And it just became so much easier to deal with.
So there's a famous scene in King of Queens. I don't know if you remember. Do you remember that sitcom?
Never watched it, but I know it.
It's basically kind of this affable blue collar guy, Kevin James. He's married to Leah Remini.
Yes.
Is that the former
Remini?
Remini? Is that how you pronounce it?
Former Scientologist? I don't know.
That's
I
right.
think
Exactly.
that's how it's said.
And they're having a fight because his she has a friend, or I don't know the exact details, but there's this chef. He's a portly fellow. He likes to eat a lot. There's this friend who's a chef who's cooking him all these meals. So he's chatting with her on the phone. She's cooking him meals at work, whatever it is. This is the friend. Leah
Whichever.
Gets jealous, and they're now fighting about the fact that he says, "But I'm not having sex with her. I'm not being unfaithful to you," and she says, "Of course you are being unfaithful to me." So now they have a big fight as to what constitutes infidelity. Now let me bring evolutionary psychology into this, because as I watched that episode, I could literally link every word that's mentioned from the script writers to a fundamental evolutionary principle. I discussed this actually in my 2011 book, The Consuming Instinct. So there's great studies that show that men and women, to your point about understanding these differences, are equally romantically jealous. So it's not that men are more jealous than women or vice versa. But here's the evolutionary insight. The trigger is different for men and women. There are two types of infidelities. There is sexual infidelity and there is emotional infidelity. So if I bring in people into the lab, and by the way, this study that I'm describing was done by David Buss and his colleagues, who's a pioneer of evolutionary psychology and a good friend of mine, who actually wrote the preface of The Consuming Instinct. You bring in people into the lab and you actually put physiological measures on them so that you know that it's an autonomic response that you're measuring. It's not that they are altering their answer for impression management or whatever. So you can do skin conductivity thing, you can do heart, blood pressure, you can do, there's all kinds of ways you can measure autonomic responses. And now I'm going to read you one of two vignettes about your partner, your husband or wife. Let's do both, irrespective of whether it's for a man or a woman. You're sitting right here in the lab, Tom. Your wife is having some really juicy sex with the super sexy Greek gardener. Mull that in your little head for a while. Now let's see the stress level. Or, hey Tom, so now this is the emotional infidelity. Hey Tom, your wife goes to lunch with her colleague, who's this really fun, affable guy. They joke around, they talk about their shared values. So it's emotional, absolutely no sex. Guess what happens to the difference between men and women? Men respond much more harshly when cued with sexual infidelity. Women respond much more harshly with emotional infidelity.
That's so crazy to me.
That is why I am the godfather. Okay. So now, why is that? What's the evolutionary reason? The greatest threat to a man's evolutionary interest is paternity uncertainty. Therefore, the thought of my wife going with another man, we're a biparental species. I don't like the idea of being cuckolded. Therefore, I've evolved the emotional, cognitive, and behavioral systems to really respond harshly to sexual territoriality infractions. On the other hand, for women, not that they are terribly pleased if you cheat on them sexually, but they're more displeased if you cheat on them emotionally, because that is a greater predictor. You mentioned earlier, I want to predict it. That is a greater predictor of the likelihood of your man packing his bags and leaving, either literally or metaphorically. Okay. And therefore, that's why, by the way, when a man often cheats on a woman and now he's trying to assuage her anger, what does he say? Whether, right?
It meant nothing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It meant nothing. I don't even remember her name. I'll never see her again. Why? Because he is assuaging the fact this is not a repeat thing. There's no chance there could ever be any emotional entanglement involved here. So this gives you an example, number one, of the value of evolutionary psychology and the value of something as practical as why men and women so often speak in completely non-intersecting ways, because we're not using theory of mind with the other sex, right? So for example, when men send, if you forgive the term, dick pics to women, they are exactly engaging in a violation of theory of mind. Because what are they doing? They're saying, I get titillated by visual stimuli. Therefore, it must be the case that women are titillated in exactly the same way. Guess what, Einstein? They're not.
Do you know how badly I want my wife to want me to send her dick pics? It's so, I feel dumb because I know that she doesn't, but I can't help wanting her to want me to do it. I know better, so I don't. But like, yeah, I get it. I get it.
So that, by the way, when I lecture to my university students about, first class, why am I going to teach this whole course using an evolutionary lens? I usually will come up with a few of these examples. Like, they're all young people that have boyfriends and girlfriends that where they get jealous. And so that's how I grip them, because I explain to them that it's not, understanding evolutionary theory is not some highfalutin, scientific thing that is void of practical value. It allows me to understand why people want the corner big office. It allows me to understand. I always tell them, I guarantee you there'll be 3-4 people in this room that in the next 2-3 years will send me an email saying, oh, I just had a fight with my husband and wife, and it's exactly because of lecture 3 from your course. I remember you said about romantic. So that, and I guess that speaks a bit to the next book that I might be writing, the power of evolutionary thinking.
No, huge. Okay, so wrapping up on variety of ideas, what is it about variety that matters? Because it isn't just challenging your own ideas. It's also, in the book, you talk about the most eminent scientists will have the broadest interests outside of their field.
Exactly.
So what's at play?
Well, because that is a proxy measure of them having that mindset of consilience, right? I can both be a photographer and a Nobel Prize winner in what I have multiple. So for example, let's give a concrete example. Analogical reasoning.
Analogical? Like from analogy?
Yeah, the ability to draw analogies to demonstrate a mechanism is actually often an important scientific tool. You're much less likely to be able to do analogical reasoning well if you're not someone who has multiple interests. Because by definition, once I have multiple interests, I'm able to analogize from domain A to domain B, hence allowing me to build bridges between these otherwise disparate areas, right? And so I can connect many parts by being able to have that synthetic mindset. And so from a practical perspective, having a penchant for intellectual variety seeking makes sense. But just from the banal perspective of the number of ecosystems that I would like to visit in my life, there's a million buffet dishes of intellectual pursuits that I'd like to navigate. I don't want to just be the very narrow guy. Now, there are very clear practical reasons why researchers are very narrow, because it allows them to build economies of scale. I already have the methodology set up to run these studies ad infinitum. I already know the literature really well. It's very hard for me when I want to publish a paper, as I did, on sex differences in OCD and why that has an evolutionary signature. Well, now I have to do the hard work. I'm not an OCD researcher. That's not my area of specialty. Now I have to get uncomfortable in going to learn a whole new area to hopefully have the chutzpah to contribute to that field. But guess what? Life is exciting that way. I'm sampling from many, many dishes of intellectual spaces. And so, just from that perspective, it's so much more exciting, which, by the way, links up to another chapter in the book, which is the title of the chapter is Life as a Playground, right? It's everything is play, right? Science itself is the highest form of play. What is science? It's puzzle making, right? There's a bunch of variables. I don't know which ones cause which other ones. And now let's have fun and figure out the story here. You were mentioning you love stories, right? Well, we are a storytelling animal, and science is telling a compelling story using evidence to back it up. So having that playful mindset, sometimes being humorous, sometimes being variety seeker, sometimes being sarcastic, life is so much poorer if you don't have that mindset.
Play is very interesting, but there's also something that's tickling in my mind about what you were talking about in terms of having a broad set of interests that I want to see if I can pull this out. So we've got the ability to make cross connections, and if I'm not mistaken, the only people that have won multiple Nobel Prizes have always been at the intersection of two different disciplines. Like they've been a biologist and a chemist or something like that. I'm not sure. Do you know
Not
that stat?
exactly that. It is true that many of the biggest breakthroughs in science happen at the intersection of disciplines. I think what you're referring to is what you mentioned earlier, which is Nobel Prize winners, on average, have greater number of broad interests than non-Nobel Prize winners. In other words, there is something unique about the broadness of interest that Nobel laureates have outside their areas of expertise. They're also photographers. They also love ceramics. They also take tango classes. Richard Feynman was a bongo player. And so they're not just these geeks that only know this one little thing.
Yeah, I'm not even sure yet what I'm trying to piece together, but I have a feeling, and it could be tied to the playfulness, but even thinking about my own life, that because I have multiple areas of interest, there's something about the way that they they have a similar response that I get when I'm meditating. It's a similar response that I think people get when they do psychedelic drugs, that is very tied to this idea of you have a better ability to think in analogy. And it's when I think of why meditation works, it puts you in a calm and creative state. But that's not interesting in and of itself. It's only interesting because areas of my brain that normally would not connect begin connecting.
Right.
And when you're able to draw on a bunch of areas where, I mean, maybe not a full-blown expert, but you've got some pretty deep experience. You've encountered other minds. You've encountered other ways of thinking about the problem that are sometimes radically different. You're able to really take the 3D object that is our lives. That's definitely an analogy. I don't mean that literally, but you're rotating it and now looking at it from a completely different angle. And if you've ever seen those shadow sculptures that are made up of like 1,000 what look like pieces of junk, and then you move the light and suddenly it creates a shadow that's like a person's face, or it may even become a sculpture of the person's face when seen from one angle, a different angle. And that feels like part of the puzzle. And that is certainly part of my addiction to learning new things. And maybe it just comes back to your nomological
You're right.
sense.
If you like that clip, check out another powerful clip right here, and I'll see you there.